You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 484, and in this one I chat with Patrick, who has kindly agreed to share his OCD story with us. And in particular, we discuss suicide-themed OCD, dreams, his early OCD memories, panic, contamination, opening up to his partner, shame, exposure and response friendship therapy. We riffed about OCD for a while, words of hope, and much more. OCD can feel overwhelming, but help is closer than you think. OCD provides expert-led, evidence-based therapy for children and adults affected by OCD. With convenient online therapy from licensed, specialised therapists and real-time support between sessions, NoCD makes getting the right treatment easier than ever. Start your journey today at nocd.com, or the link will be in the episode description. So thank you to Patrick for his time and sharing his story. I deeply appreciate it. And of course, as you know, I appreciate you guys too. Thank you for listening. It means a lot. Without further ado, here is Patrick. Welcome to the podcast, Patrick.
Hi, great to meet you.
Yeah, and you. It's good to have you on. And as you know, I'd love to hear your OCD story. So you can share that now in as little as much detail as you want to give.
Yeah, cool. I will do. So I sort of was reflecting a bit before we jumped onto the call over the last couple of days, like around sort of where to start, really, because I think for me, the OCD full diagnosis really only happened last year, right? So, but the experience of living with OCD has gone on for a really, really long time. And I was thinking about where the type of OCD that I struggle with is suicidal OCD within the harm OCD bracket, right? But there's also a couple of other patterns which are interesting kind of within that as well. So particularly, things having to be just right, orderliness, like those, some of the sort of classical bits and pieces. But I think, like, to go right back to where I first experienced something that was OCD, like, was probably about 4 years old. And what I remember was being at school. So 4 or 5 years old. So being in primary school, and there was, on Fridays you were allowed to bring like toys into class. Like, this is like years ago. I don't know if you're still allowed to do it now, but you could. And someone brought in this toy that was this like lizard. This kind of small plastic lizard, and you put it into water and it sort of expanded. It was like sort of foam lizard, but it was really slimy, and it really disgusted me. Like maybe feel like really unwell. I didn't want to be in the same room as it and stuff like that. And then the next morning, when I was waking up, getting ready for school, I was like getting ready to eat my breakfast cereals, like a bowl of like Rice Krispies, right? And I had this like thought that someone had put the lizard into the cereal and that it was like hiding under the surface and that I shouldn't eat it. So I sort of like being quite distressed. I remember like crying quite a lot and being really upset that it was there. And then like I was too scared to like try and get it out with a spoon. I couldn't like prove that it was there. I couldn't disprove it was there, I guess, was what was going on in my brain. And then I just like wouldn't eat cereal for days on end. So like sort of made, sort of would say to my friends, oh, I'll have toast instead, or like whatever, right? So, and then eventually I think like, that turned into like a bit of a pattern. So that was the first sort of like memory I have of something that felt like a thought seriously like changing my behavior and giving me that, familiar feeling that anyone with OCD would have, which is like, well, what if, or maybe it could be that kind of thing. So that sense of doubt crept in. So that was my first memory. And then I think there was like a more vivid memory that happened when I was maybe like 8 or 9 years old, right? Which was that I had a really vivid dream one night. And so I was born in like the beginning of the 80s, right? So Cold War was very much a thing. I think like my parents had let me watch Threads or something, which is this quite horrific film about nuclear war. And I had a really horrible dream one night when I was maybe 8 or 9, that there was a nuclear war. And in the dream, I had this image of my mum's face, like being on fire
Mm.
and like melting. I woke up in the night, went running into my parents' room, was like really, really petrified. And then for the next like day, um, like just could not stop seeing the image. Like it was just really, really intrusive and like really aggressive and like constantly there. I was always a kid before that who loved to read. Like anyone who's watching can see all the books behind me. That's been a big part of my life. But the there were books in the library about nuclear weapons that I'd been reading before then, and I couldn't then go into the library. And then it got like really strange, right? So like I didn't want to sleep on my own, didn't want to sleep in that room, like wanted to sleep in my brother's room, my brother. Then that was annoying for my brothers. Then it's like I had to have the dog sleeping in the room with me. And then all these other patterns started to kick in, which I think was really the genesis of the condition, right? Because what would happen is I would lay in bed, I'd hear a plane flying above, I would like start counting sort of like marks on the ceiling to try and distract myself from thinking about the image of my mom, and then believing that like if I didn't do that, then there would be a nuclear war. And it was this like sense of like, oh, there is something like I'm somehow in control of what happens, and if I don't do these things, and then it became like tapping a certain number of times. I would read like passages from the Bible. I was sort of religious when I was a kid. And those things would somehow like ward away the thought or like neutralize the anxiety that came with it. So that was like the beginning of, I think, the like of sort of OCD pattern. I think then like as a teenager was when it really became like what I would now like would understand to be like harm OCD, right? So and again, there's like quite a specific incident where I really remember the thought like locking in, right? So there was I was at a train station, the train went past really, really fast, and I had this like feeling that I might throw myself onto the track. And I couldn't, and it felt like I actually wanted to do it. And then I was terrified because I did not want to do it at all. And then it just became this like pattern of like, if I had to take it, I didn't want to take trains, so like I try and avoid those. And then it was like, oh, I have to take a train. So what can I do? So like stand outside the station, run onto the train as soon as it arrives. There's no risk that I can throw myself onto the track. All these sorts of like safety behaviors and I guess rituals and reassurances that I was trying to kind of give to myself. And it's really fascinating. So I went on to study psychology after living with these sorts of these constant recurring thoughts of harm for a long time. And even that, to an extent, was its own type of reassurance, right? Because I was trying to understand what was going on for me. So that's like the early part of the story. I guess we'll kind of stop there, but that's where it sort of that's where those are sort of three really clear examples of where you could feel like the actual condition play out in quite a vivid way, I think.
Yeah, like how it was developing and yeah, I guess what strikes me is obviously it feels like you were a very sort of sensitive child, you know, with the, I guess being quite introspective with the reading, lots of reading, and then obviously the dream, that very, very vivid dream. Did you have lots of dreams or growing up that stick out for you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the one that like, and weirdly, even to this day, it still like haunts me a little bit, right? I think so I was very sensitive as a child. Um, I also think so my mum at the time sort of struggled with some mental health issues, which were not diagnosed until a lot later in life. And I think there were just, you know, like many people who grow up in houses where there's sort of some instability, like you as a kid are trying to, in your own sort of clumsy way, figure out how to make it a bit more predictable when it's quite unpredictable. So like I think there was a bit of that in it, and it would often come out in like dreams. And because I was quite introverted, I got bullied a bit at school, so I didn't really have that many friends. Like I was very like internal as a person, so I was often trying to do stuff in my own head rather than you know doing the stuff that kids might do, which is like I don't know, go and play football or talk to their friends about something. I didn't really have that option, so it felt like I was sort of there was a lot of uncertainty around me, and so like naturally I'm going to want to try and create uncertainty. I'm trying to create certainty for myself, but doing that in your own brain, yeah, is maybe where some of it started to lock into a pattern. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And And it's not uncommon, obviously, for people with OCD to be like sensitive children. You know, I know I was, and when we think deeply, you know, whereas other children are maybe just living in the here and now,
Yeah.
making, I don't know, whatever they make, forts and play tag and other cliches. So, yeah, and then you talked about the train, and then I guess that's maybe an early indicator of like the suicidal themed OCD, of like you not wanting to jump in the tracks, but your brain kind of telling you that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, and that was like a sort of one-off incident, and then it sort of seemed to resolve itself a little bit. So it would have been about 17. Um, I think that was also it was the same time that I first experienced like depression. Um, when I went to university, so I initially went to university to study philosophy, and first year of that was really hard. A lot of sort of very personal family stuff was happening, caused a lot of like problems that I probably, you know, at the time wasn't really addressing right. But I remember there being like quite a specific, I had a really big panic attack, which I'd never had before, in like a friend's room in like like dorm, like uni dorm. And after that, it was like, I feel like that was the real inflection point where that's all I thought about, right? So like the thought was I'm going mad and I'm going to harm myself. Like I really felt like I was losing my mind. So then I went back to my room. And then because I was alone, I was like, well, there's no one here to like supervise me. So like I'm going to do something. And it was just this thought I just couldn't shake. Like it just stayed there. And then I think over time, over the next couple of weeks and months, and eventually years, like this sort of constant hypervigilance and like constantly trying to look for signs that I might be suicidal or I might be feeling a bit sadder than usual, or like where I felt the risk was greater. Like, you know, looking back now, it makes sense. But at the time, like all the sort of reassurances, like neutralizing behaviors, stuff like that would kick in around it quite heavily. So there's these like periods of time throughout my adult life where it's been really bad because it just like the thoughts were too powerful. I didn't have the right tools to just like sit with the thought and allow it to pass. It was like it would actually really inform the behavior. And I think, you know, some really good examples of like where the neutralizing behaviors came in, right? So I had this, so there's the I guess the obsession was that I would commit suicide or harm myself. And then the safety behaviors that go along with that is like try to avoid anything which might trigger me to lose control, go mad. So at first it was stuff like don't drink alcohol, stay away from like any illegal drugs, that kind of thing, like because that could imbalance your brain a bit. And then it was like, and then it came down to really, really specific things like don't take paracetamol, don't take ibuprofen, don't take aspirin. And then it became this like contamination fear of like, what if like someone puts like acid into some food that I eat, or like so then you have to eat all foods from packets because they have like safety controls in place. And like avoid like so it became this real pattern of like avoid ingesting anything or putting yourself into a place where you might imbalance the way your brain works. And that went on for a really, really, really long time until I started to do ERP, right, which is where I was able to start to challenge that thinking. And what was interesting over time is I think it was really obvious at first, right? And that's when I first sought help when I was in my early 20s. And I got, you know, I had a really good therapist. They were more focused on the panic attacks part than they were the OCD part. And I think they always never quite gave me that diagnosis. But of course, like managing the catastrophic thoughts that come with like a panic attack, which is sometimes is very different from like accepting constant thoughts of harm, right? So yeah, there were some bad behaviors that I think probably got worse under the wrong type of therapy as well. So yeah, there were these sort of moments where there are a set of like compulsions which are designed to like interact with whatever the thought is, or whatever the belief is in that moment. But the theme has always been the same thing, which is that ultimately I'll lose control of them and then kill myself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So that was your early 20s, you said? You kind of started getting the therapy?
Yeah. So I did cognitive therapy, which was like largely sort of exposure therapy, so it's sort of in the right
Okay. Yeah.
sort of ballpark. I also did sort of schema therapy as well, just to I think untangle some of like the underlying self-esteem and like depression issues and stuff like that to try and
Yeah.
undo it. But the actual like obsession would flare up for years after that. I then had another similar sort of experience. I had, a pretty severe panic attack and then felt pretty awful for a long time afterwards. And that was where really like I think this idea of you might be suicidal, you might be becoming suicidal, you're a bit depressed, or you're going to kill yourself, or you're going to harm someone else, like um, really came to the fore. And then again, it was trying the same treatment that had sort of worked to get rid of the panic attacks, at least in my early 20s.
Mm.
But it's always been there as like this sort of constant hum until I started the ERP process like last year, I think.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. So between that time and then say last year when you started, sounds like working on the OCD more directly,
Yeah.
how is it sort of playing out in your life, these kind of themes?
Yeah, I think like, one thing I will say about like OCD is it traps you in that the thoughts are like very personal
Mm.
and the thought itself is very, very easy to hide even from your very close people, right? So like, and probably to an extent from yourself, right? Because you just really are trying to avoid thinking that thought all the time, right?
Mm.
And so I think you get really good at covertly doing the compulsions, right? To the point where the compulsions are just part of your normal life and you don't realize how limiting they are.
Mm.
So, there's the thing about avoiding foods like that I sort of cleared up in my early 20s, the food bit at least, by just sort of practicing, the exposure stuff. But there was always an anxiety for me around like being in environments where like there might be drugs around or being in environments where like there was alcohol or a lot of people. And then also in environments where like I was on my own. Um, and some of the, I suppose, the rituals that you would do without people realizing you're doing them can be really hidden. Like you suddenly have the thought that like I'm going to harm someone
Mm.
else. Like you might do things which no one else would notice. Like you might start counting stuff on a wall, or like you might be in a meeting and make sure you're always sitting by the door, or you might just say something like, "Oh, I'm really sorry, I've got to take a call," like to get out because the thought is getting really intense. So like you start to build these like safety behaviors into every part of your life. And then they're just really difficult to manage. Like the administration of like
Mm.
all of those safety behaviors, it makes you late for stuff all the time.
Yeah.
Like you can't really be present. Like you're often like dishonest with people about why you're canceling going to something. And I think those things just like you're distressed a lot. So you're trying to cover up a lot. So you get quite good at kind of almost like hiding the bits of yourself. And I think it's definitely got in the way of like connecting with people in the past where like I'm just not willing to share that part of myself.
Mm.
And I think that sort of somewhat gets in the way of building like a true, like authentic connection with other people. So so that's how it really showed up, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, it can absolutely impact that kind of those social connections and relationships. Because yeah, especially if you're, as you're saying, having to sort of make excuses or at times lie or cancel, you do
Yeah.
those things enough, it can impact our relationships.
And have you sort of found that, I guess, from your own experience and like a lot of
Mm.
the people you listen to, there's like a sort of almost like performative element to how you live your life, right? Because
Yeah.
your priority is to avoid doing the thing that you believe the thought is going to make you do. So then like often you feel like you're going through life just performing a bit rather than actually like being who you actually are.
Yeah, I think performing's a good word for it. Definitely when I was a kid, that for me is like, I think I said before, like it felt like I was this weird sort of superhero. Like I don't mean that as in a good way. It was like I had this superpower, but the superpower was OCD. And I don't mean OCD being a good thing. It's hard to describe. This is just how it came to me as a kid. It was like, it was the only reference I had as a kid of, you see these superheroes, they're bitten by a spider, or no, they come from some, like Superman, some planet. And I felt like that, like had this superpower, but it just wasn't a good superpower. It was a superpower that was like horrible and I couldn't tell anyone about. So yeah, as a kid, I was performing a lot as to not people see this kind of inner creepy power. And then as I got older, lie about things, change my mind a lot, avoid things, and just, you're just lying through your teeth a lot. And it's, at least I was. And it just, even if your friends are okay with it, or partners or whoever, I think inside for me, it kind of, it's chipping away at your own like sense of self. And because you don't want to be lying, or you don't want to be.
Yeah. And it's also, I guess, like, it's making you more anxious because you know that you're lying, right? So, like, and you feel guilty a lot. So those emotions like guilt and anxiety are going to make the OCD worse. So then I don't like people talk a lot about that part of it, but that constant sense of like remorse for your actions, like quite exhausting to live with. But like, if if it helps, like, a really good example of this, me and my partner have been together for like 15 years now. And it was maybe 5 years into the relationship that I was able to talk to him about some of the stuff I was thinking. And to be like really frank, this is a really good example. I've been on like antidepressants since I was in my I started as a teenager, then came off them, went back on them a couple of times because I just couldn't quite ever learn how to manage I didn't know what the condition was really, other than just I was panicky and sometimes got a bit of depression. So like, but I've been on antidepressants for, 5 years before I met my partner. And it was only when I was at work and I had like a really big, at the time I thought I was losing control. It was obviously a panic attack. My colleagues, I was hyperventilating, which like has never really happened before. They called an ambulance because they were concerned. So the ambulance arrived and they called my partner. He came along. We're in the ambulance, went to hospital together. There was a doctor. It was like a Monday morning. Like the doctor was asking me all these kind of questions. He was like, asked me what medications I was on. And my partner was in the room. And I was like, well, I really can't lie. Like, because it's the doctor asking me. So I was like, I'm on like amitriptyline, which is the drug I was on at the time. And he asked what it was for. And I was like, it's for like anxiety and depression. My partner like was taken aback. Like, because I'd always said to him that I had like sleep epilepsy, like because that felt like a more benign thing to talk about. And then afterwards, I remember just like feeling of like, firstly relief because I had to be honest, but then also just like this like really overwhelming sense of like guilt of like I've been lying to you about this thing and I feel really terrible for it. So it's just like an example. I think we all struggle with that bit, right?
Yeah, it's a really good example. And I think, with the lying, we're doing it out of self-preservation. It's like I was saying as a kid, for me, not to be seen, because I thought if I was seen, I would be locked away. That was my fear as a kid. And obviously for everyone else, it's this fear of like, being perceived as weird or odd, or no one's going to love me if they find out I've got this stuff going on in my head, or these taboo thoughts, or whatever it is. And how was your partner when I'm assuming he was probably a bit miffed, but how was he overall?
Like really supportive.
Oh, brilliant.
Like really, really supportive. Like I'm just sad that I felt I couldn't talk to him, right? Which is like, that sort of like there's nothing worse than realizing you've made your partner sad, right? But he did everything that you would, that a loving partner would do, which was like, you can talk to him about these things, like let's get you help, and like, what do you need? And there's nothing to be ashamed of. And like, I just felt, he felt bad that I hadn't told him. Like, so it's it has this, it's a strange effect. It's like it's interesting because like, a lot of that is driven by shame, isn't it? Like because the thought itself is so horrific and disturbing, especially when you're thinking about thoughts that like you have some special power, or you're secretly suicidal, or like you secretly might stab someone or something. Like you're not going to talk to people about those things, right? Because they're so if you were those things, it would be really terrible. Like you would be quite seriously unwell and you would need help. But you're not actually those things. You just think you might be. And so you're still living with all the shame and the horror of what that experience must feel like. But then you're also not ever like that isn't really a risk. It's like it's this like your alarm system's too active, like for something which isn't ultimately harmful.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, and for you now, like you said, you've been last year. I think you said you went into therapy for OCD.
Yeah, yeah.
How's that been, and what sort of work have you been doing in therapy, and has it helped?
Yeah, I think it's I think so. So I was doing ERP, so exposure response prevention through NoCD, which has been really great, right? So and like big shout out to Carletta, who's my therapist, and it's just been really great. I think what I think what I was surprised by is that I've done bits of this therapy in different places, just it hasn't been very like focused, right? It's not being I didn't get the diagnosis of OCD until I spoke to Carletta, who did this like, full examination and was like, look, this is you've clearly got harm OCD, and clearly suicide is like the theme kind of within that.
Yeah.
And that in itself was a relief, right? Because for a long time, I just couldn't believe that it could just be that, right? It was like, no, there must be some level of me that wants to die. Like, and I'm just not able to recognize it. So just the diagnosis in itself and the thoroughness of the diagnosis and so on and so forth, I think really, really helped. And then it was like just explaining what's really going on there, like under the hood. And it isn't, it's really an illness of doubt that like what you were looking for is 100% certainty when you can never have that. So rather than trying to address every single individual thought as it happens, like you need to zoom out and really think about like the mechanism is the bit that's not helping you, right? So aside from getting to the core of like what is this central thought that you're really worried about, and then what are all these behaviors, and how much distress is being caused, like how much relief are you getting from those, and just almost like seeing it as like almost like a decision tree that's happening in your brain. I was then able to just like instead of trying to solve each thought as it happened, it was more like the thought almost doesn't matter. It's more like just the techniques do. So it doesn't matter whether I'm walking across a bridge and I get the feeling that I'm going to throw myself off it, or I don't want to go on the tube because it's really packed, and if it breaks down, I'll get anxious and then punch someone. Like rather than like like zooming into those thoughts, instead you're just saying like, all right, the OCD's kicked in. Like I can either try and talk myself out and reassure myself that it's just a thought, blah 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 blah, or I can just actually use the response prevention techniques to just like, well, maybe I'll do that, maybe I won't. Like, let's just see what happens. Like it's like that it sounds so simple, but like when you spent 42 years cultivating like a feeling that you're much more in control than you actually are, like it isn't simple, and you have to really practice it. So it's less about the, in my head, I think it'd always been about the exposure, which is, I guess, what I learned from the panic attacks work. Like it's less about doing the exposure; it's the response prevention bit that really matters, right?
Yeah.
So I found that really helpful. The other piece, kind of within it, was recognizing, and this actually was interesting. This wasn't part of like the conversations that I necessarily have with Carletta. It was more just like a sort of a recognition that I think happened while I was kind of navigating all of it. Is that actually, like, to your point about superpower, like if you think of OCD as like an operating system, it's sometimes really good with some programs. Like it's terrible with others, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're thinking you're going to kill yourself when you're in a crowded room, or you can't go on vacation because you might be in a hotel room on your own, that's horrible. But the stuff that's made me like successful in my career and a good friend to other people is also the OCD mechanism working in a different way, right? Like if there's a crisis, I'm quite good at thinking about all the possible things that could go wrong and then planning ahead a bit, right? Or like if I know someone is freaking out a bit, knowing like when to turn the reassurance on and when to just stick to the facts is also really important. Like, so there's a lot of these places where the the same mechanism that makes you quite unhappy and quite ill also is a huge benefit to you, and it is a superpower in that way. Like I would that part wouldn't change. But I think what ERP has helped me to do is allow me to see both sides of that coin, right? So like sometimes the response prevention is the right thing to do if I'm dealing with OCD thoughts. Sometimes actually like just actually leaning into the crisis that's happening and helping to solve it in real time is the right thing to do, right? So like, so I thought that was an interesting byproduct that I just never really expected, like where this is actually a good thing, although it hasn't felt like it quite often.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's, and yeah, obviously a lot of time with OCD, it's an imagined crisis, you know, and then that's where obviously it's response prevention is the answer there, because it's 100% OCD. But I think what you're speaking to is, I don't know if you heard the episode I did with Dr. Michael Allsey called The Upside of OCD.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he kind of talks about that, about saying actually the upside of OCD is what happens before the OCD. It's the you being a sensitive person, you know, that's a gift to the world. And that is the upside of OCD, but then it's that sensitivity has either not been handled or not been heard or something. And then now the OCD is there as a kind of like a negative aspect of the quality of ourselves, which is the sensitivity, you know?
Yeah. And that sensitivity piece is like really fascinating to me, right? Because so one observation I do have of myself is that the OCD has like hardened me over the years when I'm not actually a very hard person. Like fundamentally, like I am quite empathetic and I'm quite sensitive, and I really care about how other people are doing and like wanting the best thing for everyone. You know, like there's this distinction, right, which I know is a bit overused, but there's difference between like being nice and being kind. Like so, like you know, I think what being nice is someone's got spinach on their teeth, and being nice is saying to them is not telling them, and being kind to them is saying you've got spinach on your teeth, right? So like doing the best thing for the person, even if it's a little bit upsetting in the moment, right? So that is really like I think my real like nature as a person, and I think what OCD took from me for a really long time was like because I was ashamed of the thoughts and not wanting to reveal that part of myself, it sort of like hardened some of that sensitivity into just being really defensive and like really protective of stuff when I just haven't needed to be. Like the moments like where I've like, you know, like got really angry or like really frustrated or really upset with someone because like really I'm just quite scared. And it's like seeing that line between the sensitive bit of you, which is frightened, and then almost like the OCD bit of you, which is like, don't be frightened because that puts you at risk, and protect it at all costs is like the anger bit. So like, it's just like, it's an odd reflection, right? When you think about it, but there does seem to be this thing in people with OCD where there is the sensitivity, like everything's just a bit higher in the mix, right? Everything's like a little bit more audible to you. And you just don't necessarily have the tools until you have the right therapy and you've had the right conversations about it to realize like that you can either choose to accept the mix as it is, or you can try and dial things like in and out a little bit more.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I don't know why it's coming to me, but it's almost like the phrase of like OCD is kind of like sensitivity without confidence. It's that vulnerability without confidence. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's something about when we're not confident that we can handle a situation, it's no longer safe to be sensitive and vulnerable. And then this super hyper vigilant part of us comes in to protect us, but then means we shut down and get super fearful. Versus I can be vulnerable, I can be sensitive, and I know I can handle whatever comes. That's that confidence element. And I think
Yeah.
often for me, that second part isn't there when OCD's there. It's everything's going to shit. The world's going to crumble in on me. I
Yeah.
can't cope with this. And then I
Yeah.
don't want to be vulnerable anymore. And I become hard and
Yeah.
dick.
Right? It's like it
Yeah.
makes you like it makes you quite a difficult. It's like
Yeah.
actually it's like you're possessed by the OCD, right? Which is like really interesting. When I did therapy years ago, before I got it right, I think was like we talked a lot about inner critic and like what that is and like what it's there for and stuff like that. And I think like what I've come to realize is there's a lot of talk about the inner critic and it's this
Yeah.
it's sort of really haphazardly trying to help you by being a bit mean to you. Like this idea of like a child running across the road, you can either like go out to afterwards, cuddle it and be like, "Are you okay? Are you safe?" Or you can be like, "You idiot, you just ran across the road, you could have died," right? Like, and they're both trying to protect you, but the mode is different, right? And I feel like OCD is that, right? It's sort of like it's really trying to protect you and trying to bring you certainty, but it just can't do it because you're never going to have the certainty. So it like deludes you into believing it's there. So I think you summed it up really, really well. In those moments where the OCD is really present, like it's quite hard for you to be vulnerable because by being vulnerable, you're potentially allowing that thought of harm or suicide to actually happen. Like, and I think
Yeah.
that like what if you don't try and protect yourself and then you do throw yourself off a bridge? Like that's always the doubt bit that you're trying to fight with, right? Or like what if that person in the meeting does inflame you and you call them a really offensive word that you can never come back from? Like it's like those things like are these instincts that are bubbling away inside your body and you somehow are imprisoned by the OCD to believe that you might actually act on them when like the reality is that the sensitive part of you also wouldn't do that. It's just that you don't trust that bit as much, maybe.
Yeah. You don't trust yourself. Yeah. It's interesting. I think next 5 years will be quite interesting for like how we view OCD. It might not change at all, but I think things like ICBT gaining popularity, they bring slightly differing views on it, which I think is useful to have competing views. Because I think they talk about sort of learning to trust yourself, or at least trust your senses.
Yeah.
And then you can be vulnerable and trust that it's okay, and you trust yourself and that you're not going to throw yourself on a train track or
Yeah.
And obviously ERP does that, but it does it through sort of response prevention and then basically teaching yourself that you didn't throw yourself on the train tracks.
Yeah.
And you can trust that you won't do it.
It's sometimes as well, like, I think the trust bit is almost like to an extent like you've lost trust in what so the bit like it's almost like the bit where you lose trust is the bit where therapy and psychologists I guess are still like somewhat in disagreement, right? Like have you lost trust in the idea that the thought always precedes the action? Or like have you lost trust in that like the action somehow precedes the thought, right? So like it's like which is generating which. There's a really good article in the really good like editorial in the New Scientist. I don't know if you read it about OCD and some of the theory behind it. I'll share it with you. It's a really good article.
Yeah,
I encourage people to read it, but it's the like emerging neuroscience. So I studied neuroscience in the end, which is like obviously clearly trying to understand what's going on in my own brain. But the it's just interesting that actually like it's possible that the action comes first rather than the thought, which is sort of turns OCD on its head slightly because the action itself of the OCD being activated is agnostic to the thought, which is quite an interesting way to think about it. So like it wouldn't matter what thought crept in at that point, you've activated the system. So like it is therefore more receptive to the thought. And sometimes that's not good because the thought's frightening. So like, which I thought was fascinating because you'd always think you have the thought and then suddenly your body responds to it and then your behavior inhibits, but it might be the other way around, which is sort of an interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, please do share it and I'll add it to the show notes for anyone listening and is curious. I think that gives credibility to like the idea that it's not about I can't speak. Dr. Reed Wilson talks about this, where he's like, it's not about the theme. just about uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that would make sense there of the theme comes later once the
Yeah.
uncertainty's already been activated.
But so I'm really interested in this because the doubt part of it, right?
Yeah.
I would say, well, I don't know what other people would say, but like I'm pretty sure that as a person, I'm not particularly black and white, right? Like I'm usually quite good at just sitting in the grey of things. Like I think I can make decisions very quickly, but I'm always fine with being told I'm wrong. Like absolutely fine. It does not bother me, right? And I think like being challenged, I'm always open to like change my mind on stuff like that. So that like that power to be doubtful is clearly like there. It's just that like there's a discomfort that comes with that doubt when the OCD mechanism's like somehow activated, right? Or when the thought and the thought action fusion is so strong that the doubt feels necessary, right, somewhere. So but I don't know, you've done a lot of these conversations with people. Like, is that something you picked up on? Like this like sort of central thing of like, actually people with OCD are quite good at doubt, but it's just that it's almost like that bit steals your ability to believe that you are or something. It's just, I don't know, it just came to me that that might be a thing.
Yeah, you know, I've heard many therapists, and I've used this as well with clients, but I've heard many therapists say to me, like, or they'll say to their clients, or they say it to me on the podcast of, it's not that you struggle with uncertainty because just walking down the street, you're dealing with uncertainty. You don't know whether a car's going to fly off the road or there's going to be some axe-wielding murderer coming your way, or you find a winning lottery ticket. Like you're dealing with uncertainty all day, every day. You know, will I get fired from my job today? You know, will I get a promotion? Like you just make space for all of that because you don't think about it. But with OCD, for some reason, around those specific themes, the brain says, I can't tolerate uncertainty here. And again, I think this is where ICBT, with their, what do they call it, feared self idea, that maybe the reason why we're latching onto this is all of these themes of OCD we may have point to something deeper, some sort of ability that we can't cope with certain things, or and that's why we get hooked. Or maybe in traditional OCD therapy, it's like, no, it links to your values and you care about this stuff because it matters, and that's why you can't let it go. So yeah, I don't really have a good answer other than that.
Yeah, I know, it's interesting. When I was like studying psychology, like Jung and Freud were sort of out of fashion at that point, right? But it's interesting that like sort of the shadow self and stuff like that might actually be something which is now a bit more clinically understood, right? And it's like the sense that there might be a part of you that like puts the bits that you care about at risk somehow, right? So so yeah, it is interesting like how far we've come in it. And also, you know, like one thing I will say is I'm sort of like, there's, you know, two reflections on even just having this conversation. One is like, I think to your question earlier around like, you know, have you found therapy to be helpful? The fact that I can like have this sort of conversation demonstrates that at least like the shameful bit of it isn't bothering me as much, right? So that takes that sting out of it. And secondly, that like that there are people who can connect and have these conversations is really powerful. Because if I think back to being a teenager or a young adult, I felt so alone, like, or even a child, right, having that nightmare and stuff, like not being able to make sense of any of the behavior and feeling that I was going mad, and then that would compound the thoughts and stuff like that. Like if there had been something like this then, like I wouldn't have spent like, you know, most of my adult life, well, almost all of my adult life, like getting stuck on that theme. Like just I wouldn't have like I'm sort of excited to an extent that like firstly the condition itself was being understood better, and secondly that like there is more of a network and more of like a conversation happening around it so that people don't feel that sense of aloneness, right? So those two things in themselves I think are just, you know, it's like a reason to be excited about it. Like if you'd have asked me 2 years ago, I was on a trip with it was a friend's birthday actually. I only confided this in him recently, but I went on this kind of trip and I got to the hotel room and I'd fallen asleep because basically got quite drunk quite early, gone back to my hotel room and just passed out. I woke up at like 12 o'clock at night they're all out having dinner. I was like quite hungover and also feeling a bit unwell, like a bit fluey or something. And I just really freaked myself out. I was like to the point where tried everything, put on a YouTube video of like gongs, tried to meditate. That didn't really work because all I could think about is I'm in a hotel room on my own. I can't tell anyone that I'm thinking this stuff. I think I might kill myself. And then it just was like 8 hours of just panic, like, and compulsions and trying to avoid. Um, to the point where I cancelled, flew back home the next day, told everyone that I just was really sick, which was partially true, but not the real driver, right? Like there was no way 2 years ago that I could have had this sort of conversation, and there's no way that I would have understood myself enough to know that, like, you know what, you're just actually really frightened because you were having a really horrific intrusive thought and you just weren't able to do the response prevention bit. Like that's the missing tool in your pocket, right? So yeah, sorry, a bit of a rant there, but I think it's sort of almost exciting that like that we have the capacity now to really understand ourselves and to be able to like have conversations like this that just allow other people to do the same thing. So it's like massively grateful to you for the podcast. Really, it's been really helpful.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And that's a good story. And I think, yeah, every year it gets better. We get more research, more understanding, more content is put out there. So yeah, I think it's only going to get better.
Yeah.
Which is good. And yeah, so I guess, words of hope for anyone listening. What would you tell them?
Yeah, I think like it's a journey for everyone, right? And I also think there's still a lot of myth out there about what OCD is, right? I still think, you hear all the time, I know it's a cliche almost, people with OCD, at least. Like, this thing about like, oh, I'm just really OCD because I desperately tidy, or like, that kind of stuff. But then that is a part of it for some people that with the condition. But like, I think you follow your instinct a bit on it, right? Like if you're having the same thoughts all the time and they're really distressing you, there is something going on there that's at least OCD like, and just get it looked into, like really prioritize it. I like can now reflect and say that there are components of OCD that have made my life significantly better, certainly been helpful in my job, and I think helpful in like navigating lots of difficult parts of my life, right? But it is not worth suffering. Like it really isn't. And it's quite amazing to, the words of hope I would say is that like I live with a condition. If I think about that serial story right back at the beginning, I would have been 4 or 5 years old. I'm 44 this year, so we're talking 40 years of living with a condition, right? And within 3 months of working with Carletta and doing ERP, it's down. It doesn't bother me. Like it's like almost cured to an extent. I know it will flare up at times. I know during winter when I get a bit of seasonal affective disorder, or like when something actually sad happened, the thoughts are going to come back, but I know how to deal with them. And you can turn the corner on it, which I think is just, I wouldn't have believed that myself a few years ago, but genuinely, like it is life changing. And then once you've got rid of that stuff happening, you're just like just everything isn't as scary anymore. And I think you just, because you're not expending all that energy on being scared of stuff, you can spend that energy doing the stuff that you genuinely want to do and enjoy without constantly having to build the infrastructure to protect yourself from harm. So so like it is really life changing, really important to just fully engage with the process and do the work on it.
Yeah, I like that. And you can pick up the phone and call maybe the 4-year-old you. What would you tell him?
Eat the cereal, I think. That would have been the solution, because you want to find out what's at the bottom. And also, if there's nothing there, great. If there is, do you end up being sick and just see what happens?
Yeah.
That would have been that would be the advice.
Yeah.
Just do it. Don't pay that much mind. You think all sorts of stuff. That's not one to pay any attention to, I don't think.
Cool. Yeah, I like that. And then billboard. You got a billboard? What do you want written on it?
As in like a sort of like what describe the billboard to me? I'm really
Well, it's just a billboard in London. You can have
Yeah.
anything written on it you want. What do you want written on it? Doesn't have to be OCD.
I think it would be accept that being wrong is often right. Yeah, I think.
It's a brain tickler, that one.
Yeah, a little bit. I guess what I mean by it is like that actually it's all right to be proved wrong. Things are never as black and white. Like you might throw yourself off the bridge, you might not throw yourself off the bridge. Neither one of those is a foregone conclusion, right? Like, and allow yourself to be wrong. Allowing yourself to be wrong allows you to like entertain both ideas equally. Whereas believing that you're right constantly will force you to strongly polarize to one or other. And the reason I choose that is because I think that's true in all aspects of life, right? Like constantly surrounded by opinions and perspectives.
Yeah.
If everyone just entertained the idea there might be 1 or 2% wrong about something, I think I want to be much nicer to each other. But yeah, I think something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's enough of that sort of polarity and more. Actually, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Or at least,
somewhere, right?
Somewhere. But not left and right.
I think that's it. OCD makes you think you're right, a lot more right than you actually are. And I think getting more comfortable being wrong is quite a good way out of that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah. Yeah, it's that nuance, right? Okay, so lastly, anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
No, just like, well, I suppose a massive thank you to Carletta, who's my therapist. I think I might have said that already, but also just like massive thank you to like, I'm very lucky to have very good friends and family who like have watched me go on this journey over the years and really understand myself, and just like, yeah, just a huge thank you to all of you for just like being so kind.
Nice.
Yeah, and I don't think I would have ended my life in hindsight, but I think my life would have been significantly worse if those people weren't there to look after me. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's important to be grateful, which you are. So that's awesome. And thank you so much for sharing the story. It's been great chatting with you and philosophizing about OCD. We may be completely wrong, but it was an interesting conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, you can click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.